Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Robert Lowry. I'm a training specialist with our Security Academy out of our headquarters here in Roswell, Georgia, just north of Atlanta, on behalf of U.S. Security Associates. Today's subject is crowd and special event security. Freedom of speech and the right to lawful assembly are guaranteed by the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. Unfortunately, history is marked with incidents where these rights have been abused, resulting in mobs and riots that have left death and destruction in their wake. Since crowds cannot always be prevented or eliminated, effective crowd management is the key. Many crowds gather on private property, so we are the ones who must be prepared to handle any types of crowds or special events that may occur at our site. After the session, you'll be able to understand the importance of crowd management, learn proper planning procedures for crowds and special events, identify the various types of crowds and their characteristics, and learn effective tactics for dealing with crowds. Crowds can gather for many different reasons in a wide range of areas. They can form quite quickly, and while many are harmless, others can become very dangerous. The following are some of the typical crowds that you may encounter as a security officer. First, we have special events, such as concerts, parties, sporting events, sales, etc. You have crowds that form as a result of accidents, emergencies, or disasters. And of course, we have strikes or labor disputes, which we may be called on to monitor. We may have political or religious protesters, or even rioters or looters. As with many aspects in security, proper advanced planning is a key towards minimizing potential problems. Here are some helpful hints for planning for special events or crowds. First, you want to be prepared. Expect to work long hours and take abuse when called upon for strike or special event security. You know, sometimes you work crowds where the crowd isn't that happy with something going on, and they may tend to take it out on you, and we're going to talk more about that in just a little bit. You want to try and get a good night's sleep and dress according to possible weather conditions. You want to get a thorough briefing. You want to find out as much as possible about the crowd beforehand, such as what type of crowd is expected, how many people, and other vital information. Finally, try and arrive early for duty to check out the area. You want to learn your way around so that you're going to be able to direct other people on the day of your event. Next, it's very important to have an adequate traffic plan. So here are some key pointers when it comes to how you should plan for the traffic. First, make sure that parking is planned to allow for adequate access for security, police, and emergency personnel. Now, I've worked special events where I've seen this ignored, and if there's a medical emergency or security has to get somewhere quickly, they're stuck, and it can lead to chaos. So make sure that there's an ingress and egress, an open road in and out just for that. Make sure that you have emergency evacuation routes established. You may want to have signs posted telling the crowd where those routes are. You want to make sure that those routes stay clear. And of course, you don't want to allow fire hydrants to be blocked. And what could happen, particularly in residential areas where there are fire hydrants, people will park every which way just to get to the event. You can't allow that to happen. Report that to the police if it's on a public street. Next, you want to have things set up properly in advance. You've heard the 6 P's, proper planning prevents poor performance. Well, that certainly applies here. First, you want to notify law enforcement, fire, EMT personnel in advance of the event, particularly if it's going to be a large event. Make sure that they know the best routes in and out of the area. For large events, you may have law enforcement, EMT personnel on site in addition to the security personnel. Now here, if the client has hired off-duty police officers or EMT personnel, you're going to need to coordinate with them. You need to know where they're set up, what your role is, what they expect you to do. So you want to spend some time with them to get to know them. You want to set up your fixed post, your patrol routes, and communication plan well in advance of the event. Of course, this is going to be the site supervisor or ops manager's job, but you may be assisting with this process. You want to have a system of regular call-ins or radio checks on about an hourly basis whenever you're working crowds. Okay, this is very important. So there needs to be a command post set up, and generally officers need to check in with the supervisor of that command post every hour on the hour, and that's to ensure your radios function properly and that you're doing okay. Whenever possible, try and set up the barricades and things that you're going to need, traffic cones and ID checkpoints well in advance of the event. Now I'm going to cover some crowd management basics. Here's some fundamental concepts for dealing with any type of crowd. First, you want to be professional, and this means being businesslike and objective. You do not take sides or express personal feelings to the crowd or engage in unnecessary conversations with crowd participants. You must never be for or against the crowd. We're simply there to protect people and property. Okay, so you have to be very professional and objective. That can be tough because you'll have people that have been imbibing of alcohol and they're there having a good time, and they may try and be friendly or be kind of frivolous with the security personnel. You want to be friendly, but stay professional. You have to be assertive. You have to project your presence in order to get a crowd to pay attention to you. Step towards them and project your voice to the rear of the crowd, and if you need to move people or whatever it is, you tell them what you need to do so in a firm but very polite manner. Okay? Provide reasons, if you can, in a very short, concise manner. For example, ladies and gentlemen, this is a fire lane, you need to move. Okay? This is a fire lane, you need to move. That type of thing. You want to be safe. Always try and face the crowd. Try not to turn your back or let yourself get surrounded. You always want to have an escape route in mind at all times. If you get surrounded by a hostile mob, watch out all around you and quickly escape using shuffle footwork to avoid crossing your legs or losing your balance. Any of you who've taken defensive tactics training, you may have learned this, but basically you shuffle your feet as you move if you're in a crowd situation, because the last thing you want to do is fall and lose your balance, particularly if the crowd is hostile. Now let's go into the various types of crowd and effective tactics for dealing with them. The following are basic categories of crowd based on their purpose and intent. We have spectator crowds, expressive crowds, hostile crowds, acquisitive crowds, and panic and escape crowds. We'll now go over each in more detail and describe effective tactics for dealing with each type. Let's start with spectator crowds. Spectator crowds are crowds that gather to watch something. They may be planned in the case of a concert or sporting events, or they may be spontaneous, such as those that gather to watch accidents. Most spectator crowds are peaceful and tend to take direction well. So here are some tactics for working with a spectator crowd. As mentioned earlier, proper pre-planning is essential for spectator crowds. You want to quickly disperse a crowd that forms after an accident or incident. Tell them to move. Speak loud and be very clear. If people are in the way of an ambulance, let them know. Okay, let them know in no uncertain terms. You need to move. Let the ambulance get through. If there are too many people gathered in violation of a fire ordinance, for example, in a building, let them know, and people are going to have to start getting out of there. Okay. Now, when covering special event security, Don't get caught up in watching the event. Instead, you want to watch for spectators who are getting unruly, intoxicated, or disorderly, and advise them to tone it down. Now, if they do not cooperate, they need to be quickly removed for everyone's safety. And here you really need to have special training for doing that. Okay? And this is something you need to discuss with your supervisor, whether they wish for you to remove people or whether they want to leave that up to the police or other personnel. These are things you have to figure out beforehand. The key is, whenever there's a serious situation that you doubt that you can handle it properly, make sure that you consult with your supervisor and or call law enforcement. Now let's talk about expressive crowds. These are crowds involved in some sort of group expression, such as parties, political or religious demonstrations, strikes, or protest. For the most part, these crowds just either want to have a good time or just express their point of view. However, because expressive crowds are emotionally involved, they may be easily agitated if they aren't handled properly. And this is very important to know. So here are some tactics. Here are some tactics for working with expressive crowds. First, again, the prior planning comes into play. You want to have adequate manpower. It's a good idea to inform law enforcement well in advance if you know that there's going to be a labor dispute or some big party or something that can affect the public area as well. At the same time, you have to be professional and show a show of force with this type of crowd, but at the same time, this type of crowd needs to vent. Okay, they need to kind of get it out of their system. So you don't want to come across as being pushy or overbearing, okay, because that can incite the crowd to violence pretty quickly. You don't want to give the perception that you're trying to inhibit anyone's right to openly express themselves. Unnecessary interference with this type of crowd can quickly lead to hostilities. Now we're going to talk a little more specifically about strikes and labor disputes in just a few minutes, but this is something you have to keep in mind. You want to keep an eye on any crowd leaders or potential troublemakers. Try and quickly identify and remove troublemakers as quickly and discreetly as possible. And this is simply to keep them from agitating to the rest of the crowd into becoming hostile. Okay? Now this is something you need to consult with your supervisor beforehand. This is why you keep close radio communication. You want to have backup. Do not attempt to remove someone yourself. Okay? And you need to work out the logistics of removing people beforehand. Again, that isn't done in certain areas of security. Others it's called for. Finally, you don't want to allow yourself to get baited into an unnecessary confrontation. There are often people associated with expressive crowds who will threaten, harass, or throw things just to draw law enforcement or security into a situation for negative publicity. So you have to understand that some people will try and agitate you on purpose just to make you look bad or make the client look bad. Don't fall for it. Let's now talk about strikes and labor disputes. This would be some of the most commonly encountered crowds at a lot of our facilities. Strikes and labor disputes are a type of expressive crowd that can be complex and difficult to handle. So here are some important concepts specific to strikes and labor disputes. You have to realize that the right of strikers to picket or protest is a valid expression of free speech and is protected by law. Conversely, any employer, worker, customer, or visitor not participating in the strike also has a legal right to be able to enter and leave a facility without interference or intimidation from the striking employees. Okay? So both have equal rights. They have the right to strike, but management employees have the right to peaceful ingress and egress. In other words, to come and go without being harassed. And so our basic function with strikes and labor disputes is to protect everyone's rights in a professional and non-biased manner. Workers must be allowed to come and go unhindered to ensure normal business operations, and strikers should be allowed to protest as long as they comply with rules and regulations and don't interfere with the rights of others. So this can be a very fine line sometimes, as we'll mention here in just a moment. It's imperative that all officers must conduct themselves in a totally unbiased manner. Even if you're completely unbiased, which you should be, you're going to be perceived as representing management. Technically you are, okay? But you don't want to overtly take sides, and so you need to be very careful and follow your site procedures and the procedures that you've agreed upon beforehand to the letter. So you have to be very careful of what you say and what you do, and if you're ever in doubt, do consult with your supervisor before just reacting in most cases. You have to understand that improper actions can permanently poison the labor and management relationship and will be remembered and talked about for years afterwards. Okay, so just keep in mind that as a security officer, you're going to really be in the spotlight in this kind of situation. There's often, and speaking of that, there's also intense media coverage, oftentimes covering strikes or labor disputes. You'll have news reporters and TV camera crews that'll be interviewing both union and management officials, and they may attempt to interview you. They'll also try and get camera footage of strikers and security officers. So you always want to look and act your best and be very courteous to any members of the news media. Now, if some member of the news media comes up and puts a microphone in your face and starts asking questions and puts a camera on you, you want to be very polite and courteous, but don't offer any information or opinions yourself. Do not. Instead, politely refer any questions that are asked of you to your site's media relations person, whoever that may be. And you need to find out who that person's going to be beforehand. There's a potential for severe violence at strikes. Some examples can include increased theft and sabotage in the period leading up to the strike. Sometimes you'll have people on both sides who are trying to intimidate each other into a decision through the use of violence. There may be arson, bomb threats. You may have vehicles that get keyed, tire slashing, or other vandalism. Now, and of course, there can be intimidation, threats, and assaults on workers, management, and security personnel by picketers, particularly when they attempt to cross the picket lines. Now, this is where you'll get a lot of, particularly towards management or workers that don't honor the strike. As they come through, sometimes people will throw things at them, or they may throw things at you. They may key people's vehicles as they go by, or kick out windows and things like this. And these are the type of people that you're going to have to get removed. Okay, they have gotten out of hand, so you have to control this. Here's some other tactics for strikes and labor disputes. First, you want to be prepared to work long hours. It's a tough assignment. 12-hour shifts are the norm, and you're going to be subjected to quite a bit of stress. Expect harassment, threats, people spitting on you, and things being thrown at you. Just be prepared for all of that. Try and report to work early and be prepared to have to stay overnight just in case. So this is a tough assignment, but in security we have to take the good with the bad. And you won't fail to learn something if you work a strike or labor dispute, believe me. It'll be quite an experience for you. You want to be thoroughly briefed before going on strike duty. Know what you're supposed to do and not supposed to do. This helps things go much more smoothly, and it's going to reduce the likelihood of unfair labor practice charges. Okay. You want to remember that your role is to protect people and property, period. You're not to take sides or discuss strike issues with any employees, whether union or non-union. You must always conduct yourself in a professional and objective manner, and you don't want to engage in any activity that could be construed as harassing or intimidating. Okay? Now, when setting up in preparation for a strike, consider critical areas off-site where officers may need to be posted. For example, residences of management personnel, power stations, transformers adjacent to the site, some storage areas, particularly of hazardous materials. These could all be potential targets for attack as a result of the labor dispute. Okay, so you may want to have officers posted, particularly at houses of management personnel, because sometimes people will firebomb the place. They will commit acts of vandalism or try and threaten members of management's family. So these are things to keep in mind. Now let's talk about hostile crowds. Basically, a hostile crowd is a crowd whose members, under the stimulus of intense excitement and agitation, lose their sense of reason and become violent. They may begin as an expressive crowd, such as at a labor dispute, or at a concert, for example, or a big party, but they may turn hostile because of emotional stimulus and often as a result of alcohol. Okay, just telling it like it is. If you've ever worked special events, sometimes the amount of problems can be directly related to the amount of alcohol that the people are taking in, which can make things kind of tough. Rioters are hostile crowds that begin with criminal intent. Their primary cause is to attack, terrorize, and loot. So if you think of different disasters, such as Hurricane Katrina recently, you have a certain group of people who are there just to take advantage of the situation. And this is something we may be also called upon to help control. Here are some tactics for hostile crowds. First, again, prevention is very important. Try and quickly remove any agitators you have in an expressive crowd, and be extra careful to maintain a professional and non-confrontational attitude. Now again, the more sharp officers you have to show up as a group, in this case the less chance for a crowd to get out of hand, because they see the show of force, and particularly if they see that law enforcement's involved as well. Have all officers pay attention to the crowd mood and listen for any rumors that may be circulating. Rumors are the main form of communications for crowds, and they can also often be the cause of a crowd getting out of hand. So make sure any rumors that you hear or anything that you overhear or any literature that's being handed out gets quickly forwarded up to the chain of command. Inform your supervisor. They may need to meet with management to decide what the next steps are. The key here is to constantly communicate with other officers and your supervisor. Don't act on your own. You need to work as a team more than ever in this kind of situation. And of course, any time a crowd is getting out of hand, it's overwhelming the ability for you as security personnel to handle it. Get law enforcement involved. Okay, don't hesitate. And ideally, they should have been put on notice beforehand what's going on, so they're ready to respond. You don't want to jeopardize your safety or someone else's by overestimating your capabilities. Now let's talk about acquisitive crowds. Acquisitive means to get something, as in acquiring. Okay? So basically, acquisitive crowds want to acquire something. A very common example is a sale. Okay? In this case, the crowd usually begins peacefully, but may become very emotionally charged and get out of hand with people shoving and trampling each other to acquire merchandise. Now, this is very common around Christmas time, okay? And it's so contrary to the idea of Christmas, but there you go. You get these people that want to get that latest toy for their niece or nephew or something, and you have little old ladies getting into fights and things of this nature. So, particularly if you work retail, this is something to be concerned about. Anyway, looters are a hostile type of acquisitive crowd with criminal intent. We've talked about them a little already. So have any of you ever worked at a sale or auction, or have you heard of examples of crowds that have gotten out of hand at a sale? I bet a lot of you have. It tends to make headlines, and it's pretty sad when you think about it. Well, here's some tactics for acquisitive crowds. Again, going back to the 6 P's, proper planning is again essential. Sale policies really should be pre-advertised and very clearly posted at the event. Oftentimes you'll get customers that will go crazy when they go there with one understanding and then it's something else when they get to the sale. Of course, that's not your fault necessarily. That may be the client, but this is something that needs to be game planned beforehand. Perhaps one of you can advise that as a part of the planning process. You want to watch out for unruly customers. Try and mediate their grievances with store management in a very professional customer service manner, if at all possible. See, remember, these are customers. So if there's some way that you can bargain with them to get them to meet with store management, you can mediate the meeting and make sure everyone's safe, but try and work things out to their satisfaction. Win-win is the best solution. But if you get someone, particularly if they're intoxicated or they've just gotten completely out of hand, you may have to remove them and or call the police, depending on what your orders are in that situation. And of course, anytime you have people that start stealing things or looting, you have a crowd like that, that's very difficult for security to control. Call law enforcement ASAP. Now we'll cover panic and escape crowds. These are people who are panicking and fleeing from something, such as a fire or from violence. These may begin peacefully as a spectator, expressive, or acquisitive crowd, any of the ones we just talked about, but can become a dangerous mob driven by fright and the desire to escape. A very common and tragic event of panic and escape crowds is where you have large number of people who are trampled to death at concerts, sporting events, and at large dance clubs. Okay, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard about this in the paper as well. So here's some tactics. Again, it goes back to the same thing, proper planning. You need to have a proper evacuation plan in place. Make sure evacuation routes are very clearly posted. Also, you want to have as many exits as possible available and have officers assigned to each exit, or each officer needs to know where that exit is that they're responsible for, so with a certain code, an evacuation code, they're to go to those exits and help people get out of the building and make sure it's done orderly. Finally, in this situation, you want to be very alert to your own safety, move quickly, and don't allow yourself to get trampled. So to summarize, to handle any type of crowd or special event, plan properly. Be prepared. Do your homework. Do your research. Gather intelligence beforehand. Meet at least a couple of times with the security staff, all of you together, to make sure that you have a game plan and that plan is coordinated. And of course, always be professional and keep yourself safe out there. Well, this will conclude this unit.